Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and I'm here today with Dr. Colin Allen. He is Distinguished Professor and Director of Graduate Admissions in the Department of History and Philosophy of Science at the University of Pittsburgh. Dr. Allen's main areas of research concern the philosophical foundations of cognitive science and neuroscience. He is particularly interested in the scientific study of cognition in non-human animals and computers, and he has published widely on topics in the philosophy of mind, philosophy of biology, and artificial intelligence. So, Dr. Allen, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show.
Yeah, thanks very much for inviting me.
Okay, it's my pleasure. So, we're going to talk here today a little bit about cognition, the evolution of cognition, and several different aspects having to do with it. Comparative psychology also a little bit. But the first question I would like to ask you is, what is a mind?
Yeah, I like that you start with the easy question. So I think that there's something built into that question which in the form of it, which rather suggests that the answer is that it's some kind of object or entity, right? The nominal form there. But really, it's, I think, better to think of minds as some set of complex processes running in organisms of various degrees of sophistication. So I guess my general answer to that is it's some kind of process. It's some kind of activity within the organism that relates it to the world in a way that makes the behavior of the organism appropriate and adaptive to that world.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. So would you say that there is a particular stage in evolution in general? I mean, I'm not only talking about the evolution of humans or even mammals, but the evolution of organisms in general, where you can point to a mind. I mean, is there any stage in evolution where you can say, okay, this is where minds started?
Right. Probably not. I mean, it's like pointing to somebody's life history and saying this is the point at which he became bald. So we have, through evolutionary time, sort of a rapidly diversifying tree of different ways in which organisms are able to respond to their environments and accumulate responses through time in a way that makes their current behavior not just responsive to the immediate conditions, but to past conditions. And if we want to look at how that developed evolutionarily, then I think we have to take a very long view, even going back to single-cell organisms, because after all, what our own minds do, what our own brains do, what our own bodies do is the cumulative effect of trillions of cells all somehow engaged with each other. So where something that deserves the label mind arises, then we get back to my non-answer to your first question. So where do you want to draw some lines? And I think that there are some interesting transition points. So several theorists, especially Eva Jablonka and Hannah Ginsberg, have focused on various transitions that come along with increasingly sophisticated forms of learning, for instance. And others have, such as Feinberg and Mallet in their Ancient Origins of Consciousness book, have looked at the way in which organisms become responsive to stimuli that are at some physical distance from themselves. So vision becomes particularly important here because you can see quite a long way. Now, those two pairs of authors are also very much concerned with when consciousness first emerged, rather than more generally these adaptive capacities that I'm talking about. And so they're going to put different dates on things, but they converge roughly around in the vertebrate lineage with the Cambrian explosion about 540 odd million years ago, as where things start getting very interesting from point of origins of sophisticated capacities. And that's also where we start seeing an emergence of lots of very interesting body forms as well, right? So there's a close linkage here, I think, between the control problem for complex body forms and the kind of information processing that's needed to control those complex body forms, and a kind of perhaps evolutionary arms race between increasingly sophisticated creatures capable of more remote sensing. Now, the other thing I'll just say in response to your question is, where does it start? It's quite possible that this kind of capacity has emerged more than once in evolutionary time. So there may be multiple origins of this. And that's just an interesting possibility that we have to pursue. And again, if we focus in on consciousness, as Mallett and Feinberg do in their book, they actually suggest that the origins of invertebrate consciousness are separate from the origins of vertebrate consciousness, although it's an emergent phenomenon that emergent in a sort of not philosophically very loaded sense, but something that emerges once you get complicated enough body forms that have to be managed in complex enough predator-prey kinds of interactions.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, several different things there to unpack, but would you say that an organism that lacked a nervous system, or at least a central nervous system, would also lack a mind? And I'm asking you this because nowadays we have this entire field of embodied cognition, right? And so it basically puts into question if organisms really need to have a central nervous system for them to effectively interact with their environments, because the ways by which, for example, their bodies are structured at a mechanical level, for example, I mean, it seems that particularly through things that people have been exploring in artificial intelligence, that those organisms or robots, for example, are able to effectively interact with their environments and even adapt a little bit.
Right. So I think that a central nervous system is not a prerequisite. However, it's the one way in which we know that this has been accomplished in evolutionary history, in biological organisms. And I think, again, the problem is that's being solved here with the central nervous system is actually a coordination problem. How do you get a very large number of cells all working together? Now, could you accomplish that without a nervous system? Well, you'd have to have something, I think, functionally quite similar to a nervous system, which means that you have to make sure that what's going on in one limb is somehow not completely opaque to what's going on in another limb. So there has to be some route by which those things get transmitted, those activities get coordinated. So if I'm going to pick up a bottle, I have to sort of coordinate both hands to do this. And one way to do this is to centralize that control, hence a central nervous system. But it's not the only way to do it. And I think a lot of the lessons from embodied cognition is that you can actually achieve quite a bit of coordination by using something other than direct neural synaptic transmission. It just turns out that that kind of neural synaptic transmission is very fast and very effective, and it allows a bunch of other coordinations to happen. So could we build an artificial system that didn't have a central nervous system but still would be just as adaptive, intelligent, perhaps even conscious and all the rest of it? Sure, yes. Do we know how to do that? Not really, right?
Right. And isn't there a big problem that we as humans, when we think about particularly other animals' minds, that sometimes we commit to different kinds of mistakes? So, for example, sometimes we think, on the one hand, that other animals lack minds, or at least lack some properties or some features of what we tend to associate with the mind, and other times we anthropomorphize them, right? And think that maybe if they are able to interact with us in certain ways, then they have to have the corresponding mental capacities that we associate with those kinds of behaviors. Correct?
That's right. So there's sort of type 1 and type 2 errors here, which I will preface my remarks about anthropomorphism by saying I think we have similar sorts of issues when it comes to judging the minds of other human beings. So sometimes we think that people are being stupid when we really just don't understand what is the explanation for their behavior, right? And at other times we read too much. We attribute intelligence on the basis of properties that, the people are not being as smart as we imagine they are. So yes, of course, this kind of thing applies to non-human animals as well, and it's compounded by the fact that many other organisms operate effectively on different timescales than we do, and so something that seems rather unintelligent to us may be just because we're not patient enough to see how the behavior unfolds, and other times it happens so quickly that we're inattentive to it as well. So there are cases where we might be prone to under attribution because we're just not seeing the world from the organism's own perspective. The other, the type 2 type error where we over attribute is one where I think that that we do that in cases where we assume that certain kinds of bodily expressions, so certain kinds of facial expressions, for instance, mean the same in those species as they do in ours. So there's the classic case of the dolphin's smile, right? That's not really a smile. And so we, of course, apply our own criteria, the ones that help us judge what's going on cognitively, mentally, emotionally with other human beings, and sometimes then we misapply that to the animals. So yes, both kinds of errors are there. They've been understood for quite some time to be there, and there are, of course, among scientists, very different views about how you should handle those kinds of errors. So should you absolutely ban all talk of mental states in animals? That's sort of one extreme reaction to it. The other is, should we just be cautiously anthropomorphic, because that's a way to start hypothesizing, recognizing that yes, these kinds of errors can happen, but if we're careful and make good observations, then we can begin to come up with a better description of what the animals are actually doing.
Mm-hmm. Well, in terms of humans, I think we've already went through a period, particularly in psychology, where people tried to eliminate all talk about minds and even operations inside the brain. Let's say that was behaviorism. Right? Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think behaviorism certainly gets portrayed that way by current cognitive scientists and philosophers of mind, philosophers of cognitive science. I think if you actually go back and look at what was going on during that period, there was a lot more attempts to understand what was going on inside the organism than is usually given credit for. Now, of course, there were radical behaviorists, right, who adopted that term explicitly. So, I'm thinking of the people we attach this view to, such as Skinner, right, where that kind of view was prevalent. But I don't think that view was actually quite as dominant in psychology as a whole as we like to pretend it is when we talk about the history of psychology from the outside.
Mm-hmm. So we've been talking about minds in general, and before we get into the topic of cognitive ethology, that is a broad discipline that I think includes several different sub-disciplines. Could you tell us what you understand by cognition?
Yeah, so I just published a paper not so long ago called "On Not Defining Cognition." So I have a view about this, right? Which basically says, look, there's a whole bunch of really interesting phenomena that seem worthy of a common attempt to try to understand what the basis for those phenomena are. And that we can identify those phenomena. So it's this kind of temporally extended adaptive responses to environmental conditions that we want to understand how it is that organisms do that. And of course, if you take a very broad view of what I just said, then you wonder about whether things like plants are cognitive and so on. But I think that you can also, we want to make other distinctions. So there are ways in which many animals are much more immediately responsive to many more different kinds of events in the environment than your typical plant seems to be. And so there are reasons for sort of focusing on this kind of capacity and saying, what could explain that? Nervous systems then begin to loom large in this because they provide all sorts of capacities, such as coordinated activity across the different parts of the organism, which plants have very minimally, if at all. They provide kind of long-term storage of some kind, or and how that exactly is accomplished, is a subject of a lot of research, and these learning capacities. And again, some plants might show some basic forms of learning, but if we get careful and sort of talk about more and more sophisticated kinds of learning, then nervous systems again begin to loom large in what makes that possible. So I don't like to define cognition except in a working definition sort of way. It's whatever it is, right? That is supporting these sophisticated capacities to remotely sense the environment, to take the information that is sensed in this way and combine it in ways that lead to adaptive behavior over lots of different time scales. And that then leaves a lot of gray area, but then I think those gray area cases become particularly interesting because they help us find ways in which certain kinds of, say, neurological structures and certain kinds of behavioral capacities are differentiable from other simpler structures and capacities.
Mm-hmm. And when we talk about cognition and going back to some of our psychological intuitions or intuitions that we derive from our folk psychology, let's say, we usually tend to associate knowing something with explicit knowledge, that is, that the person or the organism has conscious access to what it knows, or something like that. But when we study cognition, and particularly animal cognition, we are talking about all of the types of information that the organism processes and how it deals with it, and the types of algorithms that operate in their minds, right? It doesn't have to be at a conscious level.
Yeah, I think that's right. Although it's, of course, complicated. So there is a very interesting branch of work in animal cognition on so-called metacognition. So to what extent are animals able to use some kind of internal signal of their own confidence in a particular ability or access to information in order to make choices about what to do now. So the typical paradigm here is you train the animal on some discrimination task, and humans also have been put through these kinds of experiments as some discrimination tasks which you can make increasingly difficult given the organism's own sensory system. So it might be a visual discrimination task or an auditory discrimination task, but you provide, in addition to the responses that would allow the organisms to say these are discriminable or not discriminable, you would provide an additional option that allows the organism to reject that particular trial and maybe wait some time and get a much easier trial for perhaps a lesser reward. So there's some small penalty in bailing out of the hard task and accepting the easy task. And what the findings are basically that the performance profiles of monkeys and humans are very similar. If anything, humans are slightly more risk-taking, so they will gamble on being able to discriminate something that the monkey sort of won't take that gamble. Essentially, will opt for the slightly less reward, timeout, easier task. But other than that, the profiles are extraordinarily similar. Now, within the literature, there's a whole bunch of questions about whether that experiment really shows any kind of conscious awareness of the animal's own knowledge. You know, these kinds of interpretive questions are always there, but behaviorally the profile is rather similar. And neurologically, I think we can show that the brain systems that are engaged in making this decision are rather similar. So if at some point you want to claim, but there's really something quite different going on in the human case than in the monkey case, then the burden of proof falls on the person who wants to make that claim. Explain to me what's going on differently in the human being that would account for the putative difference in what's going on here. So I think we get some confidence in attributions of similar psychological processes, even at the conscious level, at the metacognitive level, by getting more and more examples where it's hard to say what the relevant functional difference could be in these cases.
Mm-hmm. And that's where we get into issues regarding comparative psychology and evolutionary biology and what evolutionary biologists call phylogeny, and trying to understand the evolutionary history and the biological continuity of certain mental traits or mental features, right?
That's right. And you mentioned cognitive ethology earlier, and now we're talking about comparative psychology, and those two are fields which actually have rather different historical origins, although of course there's always been some conversation between the two. But ethology itself, coming out of a more biological tradition, where, as Konrad Lorenz and Nico Tinbergen argued, one could actually use the behavioral responses of organisms. So this is before it becomes cognitive ethology, but you could use the behavioral adaptations of organisms actually to reconstruct phylogeny. So they wanted to put behavior on the same level as anatomy or physiology for helping figure out what the phylogenetic relationships were. This is, of course, before DNA came in as a way to do this also. But you know, phenotypically, behavior is every bit as mappable to some phylogeny as physiology or anatomy is. But within that is an understanding that the sort of fundamentally interesting issue from phylogenetic perspective is diversification. How is it This is Darwin's original question, the origin of species. How do we end up with such diversity, right? What is the relationship between lineages and environments that produces that diversity? And of course, then the transmission of heritable traits with variation becomes part of that explanation. But the focus is always on fit of the organism in some way to its environment, and variation within a species as well as being what then enables this selection process to happen. Because if every member of a particular species was completely identical, there wouldn't be anything for selection to operate on. It would just be pure chance which ones survived and which ones didn't from the perspective of the organism's phenotype, right? So I always think the biological perspective and then the ethological perspective and then the cognitive version of the ethological perspective is one that emphasizes variation. Whereas the comparative psychologists come out of a tradition in psychology where there's explicit discussion of discovery of things such as the law of learning or the laws of psychophysics, right? So the idea was that we were going to come up with some notion of learning or perception which would be universal across all species, right? Which is exact opposite of emphasizing diversity, right? Now the truth is that there are some, because of Darwinian lineages, because of the fact that it's descent, right, from prior forms, there are some principles which carry through, but they carry through with diversification. And so I think the really interesting convergence that's happened over the last 20 years or so of the ethological perspective and the psychological perspective is in trying to understand both individual difference and evolutionary continuity within a common framework. And that's by no means simple to do that. Part of the problem here is to come up with good enough descriptions of what the phenomena are so that we can come up with decent theories of those. And as long as we're working with perhaps inadequate descriptions of the phenomena, we're off to a bad start with respect to trying to come up with adequate accounts of that.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I guess that last part will be important for us to establish a kind of bridge now, because when we're talking about ethology, we're referring mostly to studying animals and their behavior in their natural environments. But isn't it the case that cognitive ethology also gets some inputs from lab studies and certain branches of philosophy, like philosophy of mind? Or if it doesn't get inputs, at least it gets integrated with them?
Yes, I think that's the ideal, that's the dream. I think that ethology, again, before cognitive ethology, always had a lab component, but there was always also a concern to make sure that the stimuli that were used in these lab experiments were stimuli that in some sense mattered to the organism. So you think of Tinbergen's experiments with young gull chicks pecking at a model beak, right? So, and that contrasts strongly with, say, what goes on in comparative psychology, where pigeons might be asked to show that they can do some tasks using completely arbitrary geometric figures. Now, it seems obvious to me, and so I don't think I'm saying anything particularly groundbreaking here, but if you want a complete account of the cognitive diversity and commonalities of different species, you really want to study both. You want to look at this in both ways. And I think in many ways the reactions of both psychologists and ethologists to each other in the past were somewhat justified, in the sense that the psychologists looked at what the ethologists were doing and saying, well, they're not controlling their stimuli well enough to really figure out what the underlying mechanisms are from a psychological process account. But then the ethologists rightly saying, but I don't see how, putting an animal in a situation where it only ever deals with these very artificial stimuli tells me much about what my organisms are doing in a appropriate ecological context. So so in a sense, the critique of each side of the other was correct, and the right solution is to put them together somehow. But there's a lot then of question about what that somehow amounts to, right? It's easier said than done because we're trying to accommodate the multiple influences on a very complex system. I mean, even a honeybee, which has roughly 1 million neurons, right? We're nowhere close to understanding the dynamics of those million neurons, let alone those million neurons embodied in a body that has several million more cells. That is got more complex color vision than we have because it has more classes of receptors in its eyes than we have, right? The sheer complexity of that system is still, in a way, beyond our ability to study all of those interacting elements at the same time. And so naturally, you put it in the lab and you greatly simplify the honeybee's situation, and you can say something about how those bees behave in that situation. And you go out in the field and observe them doing different things that are really interesting, but then we don't have enough ability to measure what exact features of the situation they're responding to. So that's the fundamental problem. And I'll say that even boils down to the behavior of a roundworm like C. elegans, which everybody is taught that the C. elegans has exactly 302 neurons, which is a bit like saying human beings have exactly 10 fingers. Well, some of them have a few more and some have a few less, but sort of that's the norm for the hermaphroditic type. But that's embodied in an organism that's roughly something over 1,000 cells. The way in which those other cells interact with the neural cells and the way in which the neural cells interact with each other is still way beyond our capacity to describe it and model it appropriately.
Mm-hmm. So when it comes to cognition and cognitive science, I guess that for some decades now there has been an idea out there to try to explain how the mind is cognitively organized. That is the one of modularity of mind. That is that the mind would have evolved in different organisms with different modules, and I guess that each module would correspond to a specific type of evolutionarily relevant problem that the animal would have to solve and deal with and process information related to it. I mean, do you have any take on that proposal, let's say?
Well, I've got a take, and I'm not sure it's any better or worse than anybody else's take. But let me start by pointing out that what you just described as modularity of mind is actually the view that's called massive modularity, okay. Which is associated with the Tooby and Cosmides evolutionary psychology line. The original discussion of modularity of mind goes back to Fodor's book with that very title, The Modularity of Mind, and he does not subscribe to massive modularity. There, the modules are essentially perceptual channel modules, right? So vision, hearing, and so on. And that all feeds into a central system which takes the information and then does something appropriate with it. And so there you've got some idea that something more like what some current neuroscientists would call global workspace, that's Bernie Boris's term or whatever, where somehow or other all the perceptual information is now made available for a central decision maker. Now, in the Fodor version of modularity of mind, the interesting phenomena that drive him to that picture are things like lack of cognitive penetrability. So even if you know, in some rational sense, that the two lines in the Muller-Lyer arrow illusion are the same length, your visual system still delivers it to your decision-making system as being those lines of being a different length. And then you have to override that visually delivered judgment, right, in order to report that despite how things seem, they are actually the same length. So cognition then becomes, I think, this interesting control system which has the capacity to take information from sensory or perceptual modules and then evaluate that information against information from other sources. And this now gets to the temporal. We've all learned, right, over time that these two lines are the same length. I don't need to go and measure it again, right? I can be fairly confident that they are, in fact, the same length when I see this again. So there's a sort of an effect of my history on my current responses. And that gets back to my previous definition of cognition. Now, I think that something like that is true, although I believe that there's actually more cognitive penetrability of sensory systems than Fodor originally suggested. But when we jump to the massive modularity hypothesis, now we've got this picture that you correctly painted, where there's sort of individual brain regions specialized for individual tasks, and those are going to multiply according to the range of capacities that an organism has. I think that that particular view is not really sustainable given what we're finding out about two aspects of neural organization. One is the neural reuse hypothesis. So we find the same brain region actually becoming active in lots of different tasks, right? Which now suggests that if that brain region constitutes a cognitive module, we actually don't have a good idea of what the description of what it's doing really is, right? So this comes back to my point about you've got to have good descriptions of what the phenomena are before you can theorize about it well. And I think that a lot of the massive modularity views were sort of based on some inadequate descriptions of what the phenomena were. The other piece of developments in neuroscience that I think are really relevant here, and these are related. It's sort of a combination of network neuroscience and dynamical models of activity in the network. So we find that there are what we might call soft couplings between regions of the brain. So at certain points, different regions of the central nervous system might be operating in a way that makes them very independent of each other with respect to any kind of information theoretic analysis or causal analysis. But at other times, those two regions will become entrained and be then engaging in some kind of synchronized firing. And that kind of synchronicity shifts around in a very interesting and complex dynamic way under different task conditions. So the idea is, now your anterior cingulate cortex might be resonating with the prefrontal cortex, and that's going to happen when certain kinds of cognitively effortful tasks are being engaged in. At other times, those two are not so tightly coupled. But all of this comes in degrees, and so does the degree of connectivity between them. So it's not like you've got a module here that's always off doing its own thing and only focused on one task. It's more like a collective activity, and things together can accomplish things that they can't apart. And I have a kind of analogy to this, which I think is also helpful, because if you think about just organization of some business, you might have a marketing department, a legal department, a sales department, a supplies department, and so on, right? At certain times, what's going on in the marketing department might be really different from what's going on in any of these other departments. At other times, you find that they're actually there's a whole bunch of coactivity between them. So if some legal issue comes up in the marketing, right, now all of a sudden there's going to be this communication between those two departments, and together they're going to solve some problem for the corporation because of their ability to kind of synchronize their activities. And I think this kind of rough way of talking, we've got a marketing department and a legal department, sure, right, those are sort of functional modules, but they're not completely independent of each other, either under the right circumstances, and what they're doing when they're working together is going to be different from what they're doing when they're working separately. And brains are sort of like that.
Mm-hmm. So, it's interesting that we're talking about several different kinds of concepts in cognition, cognitive ethology, and other areas. And I was just thinking that nowadays, and because of the stage science is at the moment, and I mean after it's been through great development, there are very prominent science communicators out there that sometimes say something along the lines that philosophy will die, or that philosophy is no longer useful or not as useful, or sometimes they say that philosophy nowadays only serves a function of serving science in some way or another. But because we're going through all of these theoretical, conceptual bases, let's say, of cognition in this case, wouldn't you say that philosophy still has more of a role to play nowadays than the idea that those people I'm talking about put out there?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that we can also distinguish different things that philosophy and philosophers can contribute. And they vary from being in the service of science to being appropriately critical of science in certain cases. And I don't think there's one size fits all. So I think that philosophy and philosophers contribute to science or interact with science in a variety of different ways. And it's that diversity actually which constitutes the continuing strength of philosophy in relation to science. Now, I happen to be on the deeply embedded in the science end of things, but I don't think it's appropriate for people to say, "Oh, you're no longer doing philosophy." And one way in which I think I'm still doing philosophy is that the kinds of things that I learn by being very close to the science in certain ways, and even self-consciously trying to actually make some sort of contribution directly to the science. The kinds of things I learn lead me back to classic discussions in philosophy about the nature of mind, nature of cognition, and so on, in ways that I think are then helpful and informative to those discussions. More generally, too, I think that philosophical training is always going to be relevant to science. Because those of us who had that kind of background, both of my bachelor's and PhD degrees are in philosophy. I think that provides a particular way of approaching questions that is not the way that many scientists would approach them. Some of them, of course, do. Some of them even have their own philosophical training in their backgrounds, and there's the same kind of diversity among scientists. The third thing I think is, in the end of the business where I am, where I'm very close to the science, as a philosopher, I have a certain luxury that many of my scientist friends do not, which is I can read very broadly because I'm not worrying about what's going on in the lab today. I can read very broadly and connect certain dots in a way that I think that your typical working scientist doesn't have the background to be able to do that. And that includes connecting philosophical dots, right? So sometimes you see in the sciences suggestions being made where you can say, well, there's actually some interesting work in philosophy which connects to that and would sharpen up the concepts that you're trying to deploy here. So philosophy continues to be relevant in an implied sense, in a technique sense, meaning the kinds of ways we look at arguments and so on, I think are important. But I also think that feeds back in the other way because, to my mind, many of the best philosophers of their time, even René Descartes, who's sort of regarded as setting strong limits on what science can tell us about the mind. I think Descartes himself, though, his philosophy is extraordinarily driven by reflections on what science can do, right? He just happens to think that there's a boundary beyond which it can't go. But I also think that once we start recognizing more about the nature of these complex systems, that boundary begins to look less tenable, let's say.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let us explore perhaps just one last topic. I would like to ask you, because earlier in the interview we referred to things like human essentialism, when we refer to the fact that sometimes people look at other animals and they completely dismiss certain complex cognitive traits that they have. I mean, would you say that we really have a set of cognitive mechanisms that are exclusive to us, that we can't find in other species, and that would distinguish humans from other animals?
So the first thing to point to is we have large brains. Now, we're not the only organisms with similarly large brains. And some of the cetaceans, dolphins and whales, have larger brains in terms of sheer neuron count. Elephants, perhaps. There are a few organisms that have similarly large brains, but we also inherit from our primate lineage a particular way in which those brains are connected, and that enables this kind of coordination between different parts of the brain for particular tasks that we encounter to happen in humans differently than it happens in, let's say, cetaceans again, right? So it's not just size, it's structure. And there's currently quite a few debates going on about the extent to which human brain structure differs from general primate brain structure. And there are also some very interesting debates going on about the way in which certain bird brains, especially brains of birds that we regard as very intelligent, sort of corvids, crows, magpies, ravens, and parrots in particular, their brains, even though they're anatomically somewhat differently organized than mammalian and in particular primate brains, nevertheless seem to have evolved similar kinds of functional organizations. So the parts of the brain that are dealing with vision are wired into the parts of the brain that are involved in decision making. The overall abstract structure is quite comparable. So I think that what really makes humans unique is again, what makes us different is the combination of size and the particular kind of primate organization, which is highly visually structured, but also brings in other senses in ways that modulate that overall architecture. So what does size give us? Well, this is where I think things get also really interesting from the perspective of the obvious thing that everybody points to when we talk about what makes humans unique, which is language. So you have a capacity, I hope you have the capacity, and I hope your listeners have the capacity to start listening to a sentence that I started 5 seconds ago and follow me through that sentence until it comes to some sort of resolution at the end. Period, full stop, punct, right? So that whole sequence, temporal sequence there, somehow got resolved into some thing that is interpretable and actionable by the brains of those who are listening. And if you have only a small brain, maybe you can only do that for 400 milliseconds, right? It's as if, as sometimes happens to me, and I'm sure to all of us, you start a sentence and by the middle of it, you're not quite sure how you intended to finish it or how it was going to finish, and the thing just trails off into incoherence at the end. It happens more often when I'm teaching than I like, right? But there's definitely a temporal limit to our ability to do that, and I would suggest there are similar temporal limits to other organisms' ability to do that. Now, if you have a very restricted temporal window within which you can keep track of how what started here relates to what ends over here. So that's sort of just an if clause so far. I haven't finished that sentence interjection, right? But if you have that, then you can, with a very, if your buffer is really very short, there's very little matching you can do of the components. And you're not going to be able to do what we can do, which is actually start something that doesn't get matched until the very, very end of the sentence. You know, German is the sort of language in this respect, right? With other things in between being matched up. And now you get essentially the recursive structure. But the recursive structure only becomes possible because we have this longer, essentially working memory and the ability to hold several things and figure out what gets paired with what as we go along. So an organism that just doesn't have that kind of capacity is not ever going to be able to string together long sequences of sounds or symbols in a way that can be made coherent. So I think that that's a large part of what we can do, and I think it's not. And I think if we think about the evolution of this, so I've been part of a project looking at the evolution of hominid cognition, with particular focus on the period roughly 2 million years ago, where you've got hominins with brains that are barely larger than those of chimpanzees on average. And nevertheless making tools which seem to require an extended process of working, where what you do at steps 1, 2, and 3 matters for what happens at steps 13, 14, and 15. So this pressure to make effective tools for scavenging or hunting purposes, for instance, I think becomes part of the story about how we get brains that are then able to deal with these extended temporal sequences. And I want to say something else about language. What I was talking about at that buffer of a few seconds, that's just at the level of sentence. But of course, I can now say something that will take us back to the beginning of our conversation 50 minutes ago, and you've still got enough trace of that earlier part of the conversation to be able to match it to what I'm saying now. So this is happening at multiple timescales, even though you could not process one single sentence that was 55 minutes long for me to speak, right? If you write it down and interact with the symbols externally, then maybe I could write a sentence that would take 55 minutes to speak. Nobody would ever, though, be able to do that without the external crutch of doing that. So I think that there's this kind of coordination over multiple timescales that's going on in our brain as an interplay between a larger working memory type capacity, right, and the material, our material interactions with the world. So whether it's making a stone tool or writing a novel, right, those kinds of capacities depend really, really strongly on being able to keep in mind some top-level goal, right, while interacting with the materials in front of us in order to stay on track with respect to that goal. And that's something that I think is hypertrophic in humans. I don't think it's absent in other animals, but it seems to me clearly facilitated by also, not both sides of the brain and the temporal ways in which different parts of the brain can get co-activated.
But do you think it makes sense to talk about certain cognitive traits in humans as being special or not?
Well, so special is sort of a subjective term here, right? But it's certainly very special that you and I can have this conversation that can't be done with, a dog or any other organism. One can have, of course, extended relationships with dogs and chimpanzees and what have you that certainly seem to both parties, I think, to, just looking at this from the outside, seem to carry in both parties a long trace of prior interactions. So, a researcher who's worked over many years with a chimpanzee, or you who've worked over many years with your dog, both have expectations about each other's behavior that is shaped by that past experience, that is dependent on the learning systems that each of you have, and that in many ways enriches the kind of relationship that you have. And this is what we'll never have with plants, right? I mean, your plant might be sensitive, if we are to believe some of the reports, to your presence, and might respond differently. But the kinds of effects of prior interactions on current interactions are just so different there from plants than they are even for dogs or cats, let alone other human beings, right? But that again, we find that special because that's our whole lives are centered around those kinds of interactions. It's not just making the tools, going back to the hominins 2 million years ago, but it's making the tools and then going out in very dangerous situations where there are all kinds of much more biologically well-endowed predators, and stealing that elephant carcass from them or that gazelle carcass from them, working in a coordinated fashion to fend off the predators while some of us, strip the meat off the bones. Having a long history of those interactions, knowing that I can trust you to do this job quickly and trust our friend over there to, make threatening noises and throw rocks at that lion to keep it away from us while we're paying attention to the task at hand. That kind of intense sociality is also part of our form of life and makes us think others that can engage in that to the extent that they can are also special. So, come back to why dogs are so fascinating to us, because we can collaboratively hunt with them or go on rescue missions with them or just enjoy throwing frisbee with them, right? These are all sort of joint social activities which have a long history, and where that long history actually is very much important to the fact that, I now know that if I throw this frisbee, my dog is going to go chasing off after it, right? Not every dog will do that. And so that's what I think is special and what we find special, and why, we want to understand what enables that, and what is it that the dog and I have in common that enables that, while recognizing that at the same time the dog, smells the world in a different way. Smells things that I don't smell, even though I might be able to smell things that the dog can't smell as well. So we have these overlapping areas that then can constitute a shared history within a social interaction. So what's special about other humans is, of course, we share so much more with each other that we can we can have these sort of much more intense sorts of relationships.
So let me just ask you one last question. Taking into account the ethical considerations that some philosophers derive from the fact that there's a sort of biological continuity between humans and other species, and there are other animal species out there that also have rich, complex mental lives, do you also take seriously those types of questions? I mean, do you care about them or not?
Right. So I do take them seriously. I think that there's an interesting and somewhat problematic, or at least problematizable, relationship between the science and the ethics in this case. So the kinds of things that are of importance to ethics are the kinds of things that are less easily quantifiable or otherwise describable from the point of view of the science. So I've always been interested in trying to narrow that gap somehow. So I think the work that I do is ethically relevant. Although what you do when you find out that a certain organism has capacities that you think are of ethical significance, of course, still is open to discussion within the domain of ethics. You know, is it okay to sacrifice some animals for the good of other organisms of the same or different species? Those are always hard ethical questions that I think science itself doesn't give a direct answer to. But can we determine anything about the likely pain profile? What causes pain? How bad it is for different organisms? Those are questions which I think there has been some scientific progress on, and that are clearly relevant to the ethical discussion. And I think that the progress that's gone on in the science is also related to certain kinds of philosophical progress in conceptualizing those things. So as we learn more about, let me just pick one thing here, about the effects of morphine and other opioid drugs on experiences of pain in humans and the mechanisms underlying that, the more we can say about the likelihood that there are similar profiles in other animals, but also the more we can question what was once an unchallenged presumption among philosophers, that our concept of pain is such that it must necessarily be bad. If it doesn't bother you, then it's not pain, right? But what we find with morphine is that people and animals under moderate doses of morphine still show reflexive withdrawal responses to whatever is perhaps acutely causing pain, or other kinds of pain protective behaviors for more chronic forms of pain. But they in the human case report that it doesn't bother them so much. In the animal and human case, they also show that they don't show the usual kinds of learning profile with respect to getting out of the situations that are causing these reflexive pain responses. So I think that with that kind of information, we get a more sophisticated understanding of what pain is, and that can only then drive a more sophisticated ethical position with respect to whether or not it's okay to cause pain under certain circumstances, because it forces us to be much clearer about what we mean by pain in that discussion. And I'll just throw out one more thing here. We often talk about pain and suffering in the same breath, and of course the famous Bentham quote is that the important question is, can they suffer? But I actually think that there's some really interesting developments in our understanding of the neural mechanisms here that would give us good grounds for distinguishing between suffering and pain in ways that are important to the ethical debate also, but also make that distinction even more tractable when it comes to thinking about whether animals really suffer from something that might cause a momentary pain response. So yeah, I see that I am interested in those things. I always say ethics itself is above my pay grade, but I think that the kinds of understanding that we get from and clarification of the concepts that we get from looking at the mechanisms that serve all of these responses that we characterize as pain responses and suffering as I'm suggesting something different from that, really potentially inform that ethical debate.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so Dr. Allen, before we go, would you just like to tell people what are the best places on the internet for them to find your work?
I have a website which you can easily find just by Googling my name, but it's Colin Allen, all one word, .dns alias, all one word, .org. And on there you'll find my CV. And it's not very prominent on the CV, but if you roll your mouse over individual article titles there, you will often find a link to the paper itself. There's often a DOI listed there, so if you have access through an appropriate library, you can click on that DOI link. And if there's anything that you cannot find that way, then you're welcome to email me and ask me to make it available. And quite a few of my articles have ended up one way or another on the obvious places like ResearchGate and Google Scholar too. But as I said, if you can't find something and it's not linked to my CV, then send me some email.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I will be leaving links to your work in the description box of the interview so that people can go and check it out. It's very interesting. And Dr. Allen, thank you again for taking the time to come on the show, and it was a real pleasure to talk to you.
Well, and I really appreciated these questions. They're very challenging, but they're also very interesting. And so I appreciate the effort you put into constructing this interview. It was great.
Hi everybody, thank you for watching this interview until the end. As you might have noticed, since February 2018, I have been putting out regular interviews with academics and intellectuals from a variety of fields. So to keep the channel sustainable, I would like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there. Any amount, even $1, would already be a great help. Otherwise, you also have the alternatives of PayPal and Subscribestar. All of the links are in the description box of the video. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons Karen Litzke, Anne Blanchett, Perel Galarsen, Lau Guerrero, Chantel Gelinas, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Brian Rivera, Lucas Stafiniak, Sergio Condriano, Iana Henninen, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, John Connors, Adam Castle, Vega Guidi, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, David Diaz, Anian Kata, Dr. Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, and Bo Weingart, and my three producers, Isar Weber, Rosie, and Jim Frank. Thank you for all.